What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through my top 30 Dynasty running backs for fantasy football leagues. If you guys have not watched some of the other videos that we've done in this series, we've gone through and updated the quarterback rankings, the wide receiver rankings, and the tight end rankings as well. So make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you don't miss any future videos. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these running backs. All right, so as you can see, I got the tier maker pulled up on the screen. We got 7 tiers to get through all 30 running backs here in today's video. We're going to be starting at tier 1, going all the way down to tier 7. And coming in at our running back 1, we have 2 guys in this tier with Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson. Now, with the running back position, obviously, I'm going to weigh heavily the youth because the position in itself is definitely a position where age matters probably the most of any position in fantasy football. Running back peaks, at least for fantasy football purposes, typically tend to range between about 22 years old and 28 years old. Both of these guys obviously are very young, both under 23 years old currently at the moment, and they are guys that are going to be good for a long time. They both were above that 20 fantasy points per game threshold, and both of these guys should remain as dominant running backs in fantasy football for a long time. So I'm not really worried about either of these guys. We don't got to go into too much detail about either of these guys. This is the cream of the crop. You want either of these guys more than anybody in all of fantasy football right now at the running back position. Now, coming into my tier 2, I am going to be looking at 3 running backs in this tier. Again, we are a little bit more focused on the youth with Breece Hall, Achane, and then it was hard and damn near impossible for me to keep Saquon Barkley out of this tier. Now, even though I said that running back age cliff and that age peak is between 22 and 28, with 28 being the cliff, typically 84% of running backs see a decrease in value and or production at 28 years old or older. Saquon Barkley currently sits at 28 years old. Now, he did average 22.2 fantasy points per game. I think he's one of the anomalies. Sometimes we can see some of these elite running backs, for example, guys like Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara and some of these other guys who do get past that running back age cliff and they tend to prolong it a little bit further into their career. I think Saquon Barkley is going to be one of those guys. Now, with the age being about 4 or 5 years older than the 2 other guys in this tier, that is what puts him behind them. But there is no doubt that if you are a contending roster, there is probably very few, if any, running backs that will outscore Saquon Barkley in a very small window. Now, Breece Hall and Achane, I know that people are going to probably be upset that I have Breece Hall above him in my rankings. I know it was a little bit of a down year for Breece. He averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game in comparison to Achane's 17.6 fantasy points per game. I have more faith in Breece Hall as a running back in the NFL than I do Achane. Achane has the ability to be a PPR monster, and I think in those PPR formats, you have the argument of picking him over Breece Hall, but Breece Hall, to me, he feels like the more complete back. I feel like he's going to have a longer shelf life in the NFL, and I have more confidence that despite him being in a bad situation last year and still putting up 15 fantasy points per game, it feels like there is better days ahead for Breece. Even though he has burned some people, he still comes in as my running back 3. But I just want to make it clear that when we're looking at these tiers, I think you could order the tiers in whichever way you want. I'm more so focused on the tiers themselves and not necessarily the rankings within the tiers. So even though I do believe that Breece Hall is the guy above Achane at the moment, I think based on roster construction, preference, player takes, things like that, you could make arguments for either way in this tier. So I just wanted to get that one out of the way. Let's go to tier 3. We are going to be talking about 5 running backs in this tier. I have Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, Bucky, Irving, Kyren Williams, and Kenneth Walker III. That is my entire tier here. All of these guys were kind of between 14.5 fantasy points per game and 17.5 fantasy points per game this year. Now, Bucky Irving, he had the lowest of the fantasy points per game, but we do know he was in a timeshare for a majority of the year, and he was splitting with Rachaad White, and he is a rookie, so there is room for improvement in the future. The highest point scorer in this tier, Jonathan Taylor, 17.5 fantasy points per game, and this was with a year where there was a lot of uncertainty in that Colts offense. Anthony Richardson was benched for a period of time, Joe Flacco in at the quarterback, there were some injuries. It just was a very weird year for the Indianapolis Colts, and Jonathan Taylor still remained a big part of this offense. He's 26. There's 2 to 3 more years here where I think Jonathan Taylor can still be a high-end producer for fantasy football teams, and he's definitely a player I'm still comfortable with, and you might be able to buy at a slight discount right now just because some people do weigh that age a little bit heavy, and that's probably going to make him a discount in trade rooms. Now, James Cook had a hell of a year. The touchdowns went up. This is a player that a lot of people felt like he was a sell at the end of last year because of some of the production. Now he went out and did it again 2 times in a row. I think James Cook is here to stay. I think James Cook is a damn good running back, and he's going to be the identity or part of the main identity for the Buffalo Bills long term. I think they're most likely going to be coming in as the same type of offense more or less next year. I don't think that they can make a huge free agent splash at the wide receiver position, even though they do need an alpha with the departure of Stefon Diggs last year. We kind of saw that this year with Shakir and Keon Coleman and some of these other guys being mixed in. The one variable that I think is going to remain true is James Cook, and James Cook is a damn good running back. Bucky Irving, a lot of people love him. A lot of people are probably going to see running back 8 and say that I'm too low on Bucky Irving. The reality is, look, he's a rookie that came in, surprised people, overproduced, and I think because of that, because of the lack of investment that you had to put into Bucky Irving, he became a league favorite for a lot of people. Now, Bucky Irving, I think he's a damn good player. Don't hear what I'm not saying, but sometimes we need to just pump the brakes just a tiny bit. I've seen some people talking about how Bucky Irving should be in the tier 2, should be a top 5 back, should be a top 6 back. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think he's going to be here for a while, and I think he is the main running back in that backfield next year for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But Liam Cohen not being there anymore as the offensive play caller, Rachaad White still going to be in that offense whether we like it or not, and potentially some other changes in that offense entirely with Chris Godwin as a free agent and some of these other things. I think Bucky Irving is very exciting, but he's a player that I'm definitely pumping the brakes on. Even though I say that, though, he is still a top 8 running back in my rankings, so very excited about Bucky Irving long term. Kyren Williams, a lot of the talk last year was Blake Corum was going to come in and eat his lunch, take some of that lunch money, take some of the opportunity away from him. It didn't happen this year. Now, Kyren Williams did have a little bit of a fumbling issue at the end of the year. There was some opportunities there where I think if Blake Corum was healthy, he probably could have came in and got a little bit extra work. Now, he wasn't healthy because he was dealing with an arm injury. I don't know if that's really going to matter going into next year. We'll see what happens, but Kyren Williams, there is no doubt when he is on the field and when Sean McVay has the opportunity to bell cow him, he will. He loves Kyren Williams and he's going to use the hell out of Kyren Williams. So 17 fantasy points per game this year, that should remain fairly true going into next season as well. And then Kenneth Walker is kind of the last of the players in this tier for me. He's a player that I'm pretty excited about. Clint Kubiak going over to call the offense there in Seattle now going into 2025. I think there could be some more pass catching work for a guy like Kenneth Walker. Some people are going to be a little bit nervous about Zach Charbonnet still sitting around in that backfield looming behind him. I think Zach Charbonnet is a handcuff to Kenneth Walker and not really much more. So Kenneth Walker, to me, he's a player I'm very excited about. I think he'll be a little bit healthier going into next season. Hopefully that offensive line in Seattle is a little bit more improved and there are some more goal line opportunities for this offense in general. Despite all of that, he's 24 years old. He averaged 16.5 fantasy points per game, and that in itself is something to be excited about in Dynasty Fantasy Football. So I'm definitely viewing Kenneth Walker as a top 10 Dynasty back in my rankings right now. Now let's move on to tier 4. I'm not gonna lie, tier 4 is so sketchy and so scary in my opinion. I kind of talked about that running back age cliff being at 28 years old. I would say most, if not every single one of these running backs in here are at risk of the running back age cliff. But let's talk about running backs 11 to 16. Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, David Montgomery. That is the entire tier. And this tier to me is going to be make or break. I think going into next year, there's going to be some of these guys that definitely are not valued this highly. So you have to pick your poison when looking at some of these guys because the age for all of them is very concerning. The reason why they're all in tier 4 and above some other young guys that we'll talk about later like Chuba Hubbard and some of these other guys is because they've been elite producers for our fantasy football teams for a long time. Every single one of these guys has pretty much produced at 17 fantasy points per game or more over the last couple of seasons. Guys like Jacobs, Mixon, McCaffrey, Henry, these have all been elite producers, and even most of these guys were some of the top producers in the NFL this year at the position right now. So I think even though because they're all older and that is concerning based on the running back data that we see, there is a lot of production that is still being had in this tier. So Josh Jacobs at 27, 17 fantasy points per game, I think he's going to continue to be one of the bell cows in this offense for the Green Bay Packers. We saw a lot of touchdown opportunities for him this year. I think that's going to continue next year. I do believe Marshawn Lloyd will get worked in a tiny bit more, so maybe he doesn't get the full backfield next year, but he should still probably see about 80%, maybe 75%, which is a huge majority of the backfield, just a little bit less than he saw this season. Joe Mixon at 28 and a half years old, averaged 17 fantasy points per game. It looks like he's still going to be in the cards for the Houston Texans and a big producer in this offense long term. Somebody I'm not necessarily too worried about, but again, 28 and a half years old is slightly concerning. Christian McCaffrey is the big guy that I think a lot of people want to talk about because there is a massive difference in value for Christian McCaffrey depending on your league. There are some people that still believe that Christian McCaffrey had a banged up year and he can come back and still be elite next year. There are some people that believe that Christian McCaffrey, his career is over. Yes, there are people that believe that. Christian at 28 and a half years old only averaged 12 fantasy points per game this year. Now obviously he dealt a lot with the Achilles tendonitis, came back, he had a calf injury. There were some things that happened with Christian McCaffrey that made this year not very exciting for Christian McCaffrey owners. But when Christian McCaffrey was on the football field, he was being used as a massive receiving threat, the same way that he always is in this offense with Kyle Shanahan. And so I do believe with a full offseason of him getting a little bit better, I do think that next year he should be able to come in and at least be healthy week 1 and hopefully give us some numbers. Now, that being said, the injury that he has, the Achilles tendonitis, that can flare up at any point at any time. So it is going to be concerning long-term for Christian McCaffrey, especially because he is 28 and a half past that running back age cliff, and he does have a lot of wear and tear on the body. So this is definitely somebody who is very risky, but if he's healthy and if he's playing next year, I do believe that he's a player that's still going to be an elite producer because of the pass catching upside and the receiving upside that he has with a bunch of touchdown opportunities in San Francisco. Derrick Henry is an absolute monster, coming in as my running back 14. It feels like I'm just way too low on Derrick Henry, and I think the majority of the reason why I've pushed him down my rankings is because of his age, because this is a guy who has dodged the running back age cliff for so long. He's going to be going into his 32-year-old season next year, likely going to be getting an extra contract from the Baltimore Ravens. I think as long as he's there, he's going to be used on the goal line. He's going to be used heavily. This is one of the best running offenses behind Lamar Jackson with Derrick Henry here. He averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game. It's hard to really knock anything that Derrick Henry has done up to this point, and I think it's really hard to bet on Derrick Henry falling off because he's avoided it for so long. But damn, dude, if the running back age cliff does not come anytime soon, this guy just might be a cyborg. Like I said, 32 years old. It is very concerning, I think, from an age standpoint, but he is going to be devalued very heavily because of that in your fantasy football trade market. So if you're looking for a veteran running back on a contending roster, Derrick Henry has the opportunity to be a great veteran value this offseason in trade markets. Alvin Kamara is another player that's very devalued right now. He's 29 and a half years old. Obviously, the Saints didn't have a great year last year, and they're probably not going to have a great year next year either. They're kind of in a little bit of a retool / rebuilding year. Now, Alvin Kamara, absolute PPR monster, one of the best fantasy football running backs that we've seen over the last probably 2 decades. And if that sounds shocking to you, I promise you, go look at the numbers. His numbers in fantasy football have been absolutely ridiculous. Averaged 19 fantasy points per game last year despite the bad season. I think as long as the Saints or any other team wants to use him as a primary receiving option out of the backfield and use him on the goal line, same way that he's been used in New Orleans, he's going to be a fantasy football producer, so another value that you can possibly buy. David Montgomery at 27 and a half years old. He's the second youngest guy in this tier, only to Josh Jacobs, averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game this year. Obviously, this is one of the best running offenses in football in Detroit, and this is one of the best, if not the best, rushing offensive line in football. So David Montgomery should have still a ton of opportunities with Dan Campbell. Dan Campbell loves him. My only concern with David Montgomery is the departure of Ben Johnson. Now, I do not believe that David Montgomery is going to fall off, but I could see a new offensive coordinator potentially coming in and saying, hey, let's give Jahmyr Gibbs a little bit more work than we've been giving him in the past. That would not surprise me. I also wouldn't be surprised if it stays the same way, especially if they're hiring that offensive coordinator in-house there in Detroit. So David Montgomery comes in as a high-end running back 2 kind of in my rankings at the back end of this tier 4, and definitely a player I still like going into 2025. Now, here's where it really gets interesting, because tier 5 to tier 7, it feels like there's a lot of guys where you're kind of picking upside, but it feels like a lot of these guys' value isn't drastically different. So we do have a couple tier breaks. We'll talk about tier 5 first. I have 4 guys, and primarily the reason why they're in this tier by themselves with Chase Brown, Chuba, Etienne, and Tyrone Tracy is because I think they have a lot more upside than some of the other guys. There's pass catching ability from all of these guys, and all of these guys have also flashed some very fantasy friendly traits for us in those fantasy football leagues. So Chase Brown, he's a player that I definitely like. He's 25 years old, averaged 16 fantasy points per game this year. The only thing that concerns me a little bit about Chase Brown is I do believe that they will come in and bring in some extra competition in this backfield. They wanted to do that with Zach Moss this year. Zach Moss got hurt, and that did force Chase Brown into a bell cow role. I do not believe that Zach Taylor wants Chase Brown in a bell cow role. In fact, he's come out and said that he doesn't want him in that bell cow role. So I do believe there's a little bit of room for regression from Chase Brown. He can still be very fantasy friendly, and he can still be very productive even if he's not a bell cow. So I do have him at 17. He's still a player I'm excited about, but there is slight concerns about workload in the future. Chuba Hubbard is another player that I really like this year. He's 25. He averaged 16.1 fantasy points per game, and that was the bell cow role with Jonathan Brooks, their rookie, who did have the re-tear of the ACL, out for the majority of the year. And then, like I said, when he came back, he re-tore the ACL. Chuba could have the majority of the workload again next season. We've kind of seen him be very productive with Dave Canales, and Dave Canales does like to use those running backs in that bell cow type of system. However, I would not be surprised with this deep cheap running back class in 2025 to see them go get another guy if they're a little bit concerned about the long-term longevity of a guy like Jonathan Brooks. I know they invested a second-round pick in him. So far, it has not been good, and sometimes when we see those back-to-back injuries like that, it can entirely derail a running back's career. But Chuba Hubbard could be a sneaky bell cow going into next year if they don't add additional competition to this room, but I think that there's a chance they will. ETN is another player that I think a lot of people are very low on. I'm definitely much higher on ETN, I think, than consensus at the moment. Even though he's only my running back 19, it does feel kind of crazy to say, but with Travis Etienne, he's still only 26 years old. He obviously had a very down year last year, battled with a little bit of injury. It wasn't a good offensive scheme for Travis Etienne, and we did see the emergence of Tank Bigsby a little bit as well. With Liam Cohen going into this offense, I do think that is very positive for a guy like Travis Etienne. He's definitely the more elusive back than a guy like Tank Bigsby, and I could see him getting a little bit more of that Bucky Irving type of role, whereas Tank Bigsby could kind of equal that Rachaad White type of role. So there is some hope for Travis Etienne. He's a sneaky buy that I've kind of been targeting if the value is very cheap in your leagues, because there are people who are very down on Etienne. I still think that there's some upside for him, so he's definitely a player that I'm still looking at in my leagues. Tyrone Tracy Jr. is another player that I'm excited about. He's 25 years old. He averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game. We saw him take over that backfield from Devin Singletary, and that was very positive because this is only the second year that Tyrone Tracy has played running back. He is a converted wide receiver, and that's good for fantasy football because the PPR upside is immense when those guys do have those pass catching chops. Now, the only issue is that when you spend as little draft capital as you do in Tyrone Tracy, there's always going to be worries about competition coming into your backfield. And like I said, this 2025 rookie running back class is very strong. There is a chance that they bring in some additional work, but if they don't, and it's still just Devin Singletary and Tyrone Tracy, which for the record, I do believe that the Giants have bigger needs to fill than their running back room. They can go forward next year with Tracy and Singletary and be fine. This is a player who can be a very fine running back too for our fantasy football leagues, and he's a player that didn't cost us a lot to get on our teams last year in rookie drafts. Let's go to tier 6. Tier 6, like I said, not a big difference from the guys in tier 5 to me, but there is a little bit less upside with these players. Najee Harris, Isaiah Pacheco, J.K. Dobbins, Ramondre Stevenson, and Brian Robinson Jr. That's the entire tier. Couple concerns, I think, with most of these guys. Najee Harris is going to be a free agent. He's going to be 27 years old. He only averaged 12 fantasy points per game this year. Where does he go? What does the workload look like? And how close is he going to be to that running back age cliff? There's definitely some things to be concerned about Najee Harris. Isaiah Pacheco, 26 years old, not a lot of draft capital, a good rookie running back class coming in, and he only averaged 8 fantasy points per game this year after dealing with that big injury to the leg. Obviously, that's hampered his production a lot this year, so I'm not going to knock Pacheco too much, but we've seen guys like Kareem Hunt come in and have some production in this backfield, and we've seen the Chiefs have some success running 2 running backs in here. Could they go get a rookie to spell Isaiah Pacheco next year, or at least be in a timeshare with him, with Isaiah Pacheco potentially getting a new contract here in the future, because his contract is up in just a year? I definitely wouldn't be surprised about it, so he's a player that I'm pumping the brakes on right now, and I think he's a little bit risky to invest in. Let's go to J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins, again, a player who had a resurgence this year, definitely the highest point scorer in this tier at 14.8 fantasy points per game. 26 years old. We know the Los Angeles Chargers have kind of been looking for some running back help. This would be the running back class to go in and get that running back of the future for your team. J.K. Dobbins has been a home run signing for them so far, especially when you consider how much money that they gave him. Greg Roman loves him. Jim Harbaugh loves him. I think he's going to be fine. He's going to be on this roster long term, but there could be some added competition in this backfield, and that does worry me for J.K. Dobbins, who does have an extensive injury history. Ramondre Stevenson comes in as my running back 24. He's going to be 27 years old. He averaged 11.7 fantasy points per game. There was times this year where the old coaching staff was benching Ramondre Stevenson and then starting Ramondre Stevenson and then benching Ramondre Stevenson. It just wasn't great for him. He dealt with a little bit of fumbling issues at times. Vrabel's going to come in, and Vrabel's going to be a guy that makes this very interesting. I don't know if he's going to like the guys on the roster. I don't know if he's going to want to go and get some of his own guys. We've seen Vrabel in the past bell cow running backs like Derrick Henry, but obviously Derrick Henry is an anomaly. However, I would not be surprised if Ramondre Stevenson potentially gets some added competition and or replaced in this backfield, despite the fact that he did get a contract extension last year. I think some of that was funny money. There is definitely some money there that isn't necessarily going to hurt the New England Patriots if they do get off of Ramondre Stevenson, but he's a player that I'm a little bit concerned about going into 2025, and I'm not necessarily trying to invest a ton into him. Brian Robinson Jr. is a fine running back. I think he's a good, not great option at this point. 11.4 fantasy points per game. He definitely doesn't have the pass catching upside. That's why they brought in a guy like Austin Eckler, who has seen some of the receiving work. He's a guy that probably has a low fantasy football ceiling, where if he does get into the end zone, you're happy with him most weeks. If he doesn't get into the end zone, it is what it is. You're not going to be too happy with him. But Brian Robinson Jr., I'm not necessarily worried about job security. I just don't see a ceiling with this guy in this offense with Austin Eckler taking the pass catching work. And now let's go to my last tier. My last tier is tier 7. I got 5 running backs in this tier as well. We're going to go DeAndre Swift, Tony Pollard, James Conner, Aaron Jones, and Trey Benson. And this is definitely a weird tier, to be honest. DeAndre Swift, he's definitely a player that I think is going to get added competition and or just be replaced entirely in the Chicago Bears offense. It didn't work last year. Ben Johnson obviously already had an opportunity to coach DeAndre Swift, and that didn't work out for them. They parted ways, and that's why Swift went to Philly, and then Philly parted ways with DeAndre Swift and sent him to Chicago as well. I think it's potentially going to be another team for DeAndre Swift in 2025, and or he's going to be pretty much a change of pace back, a backup option to where in 2026 he'll be able to be released and go to another team after that. But I'm not feeling great about DeAndre Swift, unfortunately, with the Chicago Bears. And I've already kind of seen some rumors about Achane potentially being in play at pick 10. And if that was the case, obviously Swift is not starting over Ginty, so that'll definitely be something to watch. Tony Pollard's another player here, almost 28 years old, 12 fantasy points per game, was in a timeshare with Tyjae Spears when Tyjae Spears got healthier. I think he's a player that's good, not great again. This is kind of a player we thought could get a resurgence there in Tennessee, and it just didn't happen. I think he had a good year back in Dallas, and a lot of people liked him off of that. At this point in time, it kind of feels like that one year was kind of an anomaly. It was a breakout year that just didn't really have much substance to it. So Tony Pollard, I'm not super excited about him, and I wouldn't be surprised if eventually Tyjae Spears gets the nod as the 1A in this backfield to the 1B with Tony Pollard. James Conner and Aaron Jones are two players that I think are probably down here only because of age. The production has been fine, 15 and 14 fantasy points per game for the two, but both of these guys are going to be 30 plus going into next season. I think there's a chance that one, James Conner has some added competition from Trey Benson in year 2, which Trey Benson's the player that I did like coming into last year's draft class. He just didn't get a lot of run this year, and Aaron Jones could have some added competition via the NFL draft from the Minnesota Vikings. I think they end up looking at another running back option in this backfield. So both of these players definitely have risk. They've been productive so far up to this point in their career, but I feel less confident in those guys than I do some of the older running backs that are 27, 28 years old, like Joe Mixon, Christian McCaffrey, Josh Jacobs. And then last but not least, we kind of touched on it, Trey Benson. I think this is a running back who, if he's going to ever take over this backfield, is probably going to be in this 2025 season, maybe in the back half of the year. We've seen James Conner kind of have injury concerns in the past. I think Trey Benson has a lot of juice. I think he has some pass catching upside, and I think he would probably be the better running back in this backfield long term for the Arizona Cardinals, who do probably kind of need to move over to this youth that they have on the roster in Marvin and Kyler and Trey Benson and Trey McBride, and move forward with that group of guys rather than some of the older guys on the roster. So there you have it, folks. That is my top 30 running backs in Dynasty Fantasy Football right now and how I am viewing them going into the 2025 season. Like I said, this 2025 rookie class at the running back position is so deep, it's so good, it's going to be messy. A lot of this is going to get messed up just 3 months from now after the NFL draft, but I think right now this is a good way to view the current running back market and see where there could be some potential values, maybe some buys, maybe some sells based on how I am currently ranking these guys. If you did enjoy the video, hit the like button. If you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you don't miss any future videos. We are trying to get to 5,000 subscribers, so I would appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and helped us get there. And last but not least, make sure you join our Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next video. But until then, peace out.